Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
And it is the day after, the day in which we now know Donald Trump is the president-elect, will be the 47th president of the United States after winning at least 277 electoral college votes. The vote is not all the way in yet, Joe, but it is not just an electoral college victory we're looking at, but in all likelihood, a popular vote victory, as well as we await the final tally. However, we don't have the final tally for the ultimate majority in the Senate, as there are still a number of races to be called, or the majority in the House of Representatives.
That's true. We do expect to hear from Vice President Kamala Harris a little bit later on today. She chose not to speak last night, which was an interesting element of the optics on our election night. She will be speaking at 4 p.m. Eastern time. We'll, of course, bring her remarks to you. It's unclear to us if she has conceded on a personal level to Donald Trump. We haven't heard news of a phone call, for instance. But I was struck following our coverage at about 4 o'clock in the morning Eastern time here, Kailey, to see law enforcement surround Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue. It was clear, even if you were just walking the streets of New York, that something had changed. The transition is underway now, even as we wait for many other races to be called, including some key Senate races. We want to get into this with Bloomberg's Michael Shepard, who joins us now from our Washington, D.C. bureau. Shep was up all night with us, and it's great to see you, Mike. Your thoughts as we wait to hear from the vice president. Why are we waiting so long?
Well, I think one of the reasons for the delay, Joe, is just how difficult this is for the vice president and her campaign. This is not the speech they had been anticipating giving. Even yesterday afternoon, over the weekend, the campaign had seen some polls that suggested the race might be breaking a little bit more in her direction. And of course, now we know, based on the results, that was not the case. It's also going to be a challenge for her because you remember that for weeks, on the campaign trail and on the stump, she was warning voters that her opponent, Donald Trump, was unfit for office. So how she frames this speech, conceding to somebody she didn't think deserved the presidency, will be difficult to do, and to do graciously as well.
Well, this also may be a speech, Mike, that she wasn't prepared to have to give so soon, whether it is a concession speech or a victory speech. We thought the final result would take a lot longer than it did to figure out. Within 24 hours, we knew that Donald Trump would be president-elect. Can you just talk about briefly how much more efficiently it seems the votes were counted, how this election was won? By all accounts, it does seem like this was secure, this was safe. The democratic system worked.
Yeah, Kailey, I'm glad you brought that up, because you know that for weeks we've been talking in the newsroom, and everybody out there observing this election ahead of time was anticipating that it would be delayed the way it was in 2020. But what we've seen since then is state officials and state operations really tightened up their game, and they tried to prepare to ensure a faster, cleaner count that would be much more difficult to challenge. And we saw that. Another factor also was that it actually ended up being a much wider margin of victory, including in some of those battleground states that ultimately handed the presidency to Donald Trump.
Well, Michael, I don't know exactly, as we said, what we're going to hear from Vice President Kamala Harris a bit later, but we have heard from Donald Trump. How did the optics strike you on the stage last evening in West Palm Beach when the likes of Dana White joined the former president on the stage, along with the Speaker of the House? When you consider the contrast culturally of what we saw, how does it inform your expectations of a Trump 2.0?
Well, it highlighted the way that the former president has built this coalition, and he really has tried to cement the so-called MAGA brand in the Republican Party, and now for good. This victory in the presidential election seals it for many years to come. And certainly the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, is someone who is very much part of the Trump camp. And the other thing you mentioned, of course, was Dana White of the wrestling fame, and ripping open his shirt on the convention stage in July. That points to how he had the former president had targeted male voters very directly. We called it, in a way, the bro campaign, and it worked. It helped push his numbers with male voters, and including with black men and Latino men as they headed to the polls yesterday. Mm-hmm.
All right, Bloomberg's Michael Shepard reporting from Washington, D.C. for us. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. And of course, we have been touching base not only with Mike Shepard and the rest of our Bloomberg team throughout this cycle, but our next guest as well. Frank Luntz, famed pollster and founder of FIL Inc., is joining us now. Frank, thanks for being back with us on Bloomberg TV and radio. We have been talking about this entire cycle, how tight margins were likely to be. Turns out they're not quite as tight in most of these battleground states as they were in 2020. And I just wonder your takeaway here when it comes to whether or not the polls were adequately reflecting the reality in America. Once again, doesn't it seem like polls underestimated Donald Trump?
To a small degree, yes. And that is about turnout. That every Trump supporter became a Trump voter. But that is not the case with Kamala Harris. And that's one of the reasons why she fell short. Certainly the idea that Trump would get a majority of the popular vote is a surprise to a lot of people right now, and is the Iowa poll, which I want to draw attention to because that changed the actual narrative of the campaign for the last 48 hours. Trump ended up winning Iowa by about a dozen points or so. The poll had Harris up by 3. It was not only beyond the margin of error, it actually changed how the race was being covered, which is really one of the rare times when survey research actually becomes part of the narrative. I think that there's a lesson for Americans in the future, which is to spend a lot less time talking about who's winning and losing, and a lot more time talking about what the candidates say they're going to do and why either we should believe them or distrust them.
Sounds like people were wrong about a lot, Frank. They were wrong about the protesters showing up at the DNC. They were wrong about violence around polls, wrong about poll watchers, wrong about, in some cases, even though our polls were tied, the idea that there was momentum behind Kamala Harris as well. I'm wondering if there's a reckoning here for pollsters. Was there an overcorrection in the sample, and what's going through your mind today?
What's going through my mind, because I've been asked this in almost every show, is this is the media. The pollsters did get it wrong. But the media went all over this Iowa survey, went all over trying to see some trends, some movement in one direction or another, and that they're the ones who drove this. I tend not to talk about polling when I do shows like this. I talk about policy. Yep. I talk about language, what the public wants to see and hear, and whether the politicians are doing it or not. And so much of this is actually driven by those who ask the questions rather than people like me who answer them. Because we wouldn't answer them if we weren't asked them. I don't want to make a blanket statement because I take this so seriously. And I so approve of the way your show handles politics. It's one of the best shows in all of television for politics. But I do think that there needs to be a reckoning for what we choose to focus on and how we cover it, because in the end, it becomes misleading or even detrimental to the political process, as that Iowa survey clearly was.
Well, Frank, we appreciate the kind words. And of course, there always is room for critique when we consider how the narrative is shaped in America, and media plays a role in that as well. I think we can all agree. Earlier on in this cycle, there was a few conversations that happened in quick succession, one being whether or not the media was putting too much focus on the age issue for Joe Biden, then became whether or not the media was complicit in covering up how deep those issues may have run for the current president. And I just wonder, as we consider the role of Joe Biden in all of this, his late withdrawal from his reelection campaign, if ultimately you think that made a difference, if the timing mattered, or if it was never going to be possible for an incumbent administration, given the kind of inflation experienced during it, to keep hold of the White House.
I don't believe that. I challenge the narrative which has been put forward now for weeks. Vice President Harris had one of the sharpest, fastest rises of any candidate in modern history. She went from 5 points down when she got into the race to 3.5 points up in a matter of a few weeks because she was joyful. She talked about the things she wanted to do instead of the negativity. which she decried again and again, she was hopeful and optimistic and talked about all the things that she wanted to get done. But then after the convention, she turned dark. She turned negative. It sounded as much like a Trump campaign as it did a Harris campaign. And that was when she hit her ceiling. And then and by changing this, by being joyful and then being harshly negative, calling Trump a fascist, voters started to wonder, who is she? Is she authentic? Is she genuine? How do you go from being joyful to damning your opponents? And then Biden, of course, made the comment about Trump's voters, and it didn't ring true. That's number one. And number two is she never articulated exactly what she wanted to do in the first hour, in the first day, first week, first month, first 100 days, and so on. If she had done that in the CNN town hall, where it's done live, if she had done that in the 60 Minutes interview or the Fox interview, any of these, if she had done that and told voters exactly what she wanted to do, she would have done much better, because then it would have been about policy, and that's where she was weakest. But instead, she got driven around. She never answered the questions that voters had, and so she never crossed that threshold. Whereas Donald Trump, we knew him. There was nothing more we could learn about him. We knew his weaknesses, we knew his strengths, we knew his record because we saw it for 4 years. So her criticizing him didn't add anything to her, did not detract from him, and I think that that's one of the reasons why she lost.
The diagnosis from Frank Luntz on Bloomberg TV and radio. All of that said, Frank, what did we learn about our nation last night, particularly if this in fact was about men versus women?
I love that question. And that's a question that we need to be talking about over the coming weeks and months, because there are some things that are more important than an election. It's the next generation. And what are they learning? They're learning that it's okay to tear your opponent apart. They're learning that there is no bounds to negativity, that there are right and wrong ways. But they need to learn that there are right and wrong ways to approach politics, to approach economics, to approach day-to-day life. And I'm just afraid that what we now learned is the wrong thing, which is anything goes at any time for any reason. And that frightens me for the future.
Well, okay, so if we keep looking at demographics here and what the future may hold, Frank, I look at Donald Trump's victory in Miami-Dade last night. We haven't seen a Republican win that county for decades. It obviously is majority Hispanic. We did see a sizable break among Latinos for Donald Trump in a way we haven't seen in the past. Obviously, movement for black voters as well. And I wonder if you think those demographic shifts are unique to this candidate who is now president-elect, or if that may be something more permanent.
It's unique to this candidate, but also to this time, that it doesn't matter whether you're white, black, brown, it doesn't matter. If you have trouble affording food, to put food on your table, to put gas in your car, or the health care you need and the housing that you want, then it doesn't matter what your ethnicity is. What matters is you're struggling. You're living paycheck to paycheck. And that's what's happening right now. And Donald Trump articulated an empathy to that much more explicitly than Harris did. She tried to run away from it. Now, Trump's greatest weakness is he didn't focus enough on prices, on costs, on affordability. That instead he got sidetracked by issues that did not matter. And in fact, I want to acknowledge something. I'm going to go back to that presidential debate that clearly she did relatively well and he did relatively poorly. In the end, it did not matter. I thought the debate performance would cost him his candidacy. And instead, it actually did not matter. And that's another learning that America has to face, that even when you put two candidates side by side, the outcome does not necessarily matter in who wins for president.
Really great to have you back, Frank. Frank Luntz, founder, CEO, FIL, and just the voice we were looking to hear today. Thanks for being with us throughout this entire campaign here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Donald Trump had any number of economic policy proposals that we've talked about over the past couple of months that brought us to this point. Here's a taste.
What I'm going to do is something that nobody has ever even thought about doing, No tax on tips. As part of our additional tax cuts, we will end all taxes on overtime. I want to cut taxes on Americans while putting tariffs on China and foreign countries to bring our jobs back home. My plan is to make the Trump tax cuts permanent. They are massive tax cuts, biggest ever, permanent. And to cut taxes even more, a reduction in the corporate tax rate from 21% to 15%. No tax on Social Security benefits. Restoring the SALT deduction, saving thousands of dollars for residents of New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and other high-cost states. As part of our tax cuts, we will make interest on car loans fully deductible.
And joining us now, Joe Lavorgna, chief economist with SMBC Nikko Securities America, the former chief economist of the White House National Economic Council in the first Trump administration. Nice to see you at the table here. I bet you've been up all night. I can only imagine what the last 24 hours have been like for you.
Thank you for having me. I was on earlier in the week sitting over there.
Absolutely. Well, nice. You know this table very well, and you've been generous with your time over the course of this cycle. We've got a lot of questions for you here, beginning with this market reaction. This is a monster move to see a day in which the Dow's up over 1,000 points, the S&P 500 is up some 2%, but the bond market is moving in the other direction. We're looking at a 4.5 here as of this moment on the 10-year. What do you make specifically of the reaction in the bond market? This is clearly in anticipation of some sort of inflationary event.
Well, here's the thing. When I was talking with investors and clients, as I do, that's most of my day job, the simple question is, what happens if Harris wins? What happens if Trump wins? And my initial read, in very simplistic terms, was Harris, bad for equities, good for bonds. Trump, good for equities, bad for bonds. And that related to the fact where I see growth and also how the market initially would react to things. So, for example, with Trump, equities are up because the market's more excited about growth, lower tax rates, less regulation, et cetera. But the bond market gets worried about more spending, tax cuts, et cetera. And like the CBO, for example, they're going to initially probably score a Trump budget as being, more deficit-related spending. The Tax Foundation found that. The problem with it is that we don't know the specifics yet. And I'd argue if you look back at the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 and you see what CBO scored, the revenue numbers in 16, we actually got the money in 18. In other words, the tax cut paid for itself. So I think these are knee-jerk reactions, and then we'll see what happens once we get some meat to the bone.
Well, so as you consider the timeline you just said there, knowing that there was $8 trillion in deficit added during the first Trump administration, the Committee for Responsible Budget says it could be another $15 trillion, if not all of it pays for itself. But it is a question of time, especially knowing these markets are discounting mechanisms. They are looking well ahead. So when we consider sequencing here, things like tariffs, that could potentially hit the economy first before the actual beneficiary impacts of lower taxes is fully felt and recognized in corporate profits and the like, right? How should we think about the way in which this plays out?
Right. So you're absolutely right. Markets are forward-looking, and they may fear or they could think that, okay, tariffs are inflationary. It's a one-off price adjustment. But again, it would be how are the tariffs implemented? And what would the U.S. be getting in return? I think there's this misperception that day one of Trump, we're going to have tariffs across the board, X%, and this is my guess, and in China it's going to be at least 60%, maybe higher. To me, it's going to be more nuanced. It's going to be very transactional. In other words, tariffs are going to be used in large part as a tool to essentially have more fair trade. So, for example, the U.S. has certain environmental regulations and certain rules against child labor. Some of our trading partners don't have those same rules, and we're at a disadvantage. So to the extent tariffs can level the playing field and make trade fair, I think that makes sense. Also, it would depend, too, what happens with energy policy. If we have a significant amount of drilling and energy production, that will offset the tariffs, even if the tariffs, for argument's sake, were implemented across the board. The energy share of the economy is bigger than the import share of the economy. So it really depends how it's going to be put into place. And I always tell people, look at things, the broad policy set. Like, don't focus just on the tariffs. Don't focus just on the tax cuts. Look at the holistic approach in terms of trying to increase productive capacity.
I guess a simpler way, though, of asking my question would be, are we likely to feel the inflation before we feel the growth?
No, I don't believe so. I don't believe so because if energy prices stay low, that will immediately hit people's pocketbooks in a positive way. Prices will come down. The general rule of thumb is every 1 penny change in gasoline is worth about $1 billion in terms of an energy tax cut. So if you get prices down 50 cents, may not seem like a lot, but in a $25 trillion economy, that's basically like a $50 billion tax cut immediately.
What do you make of the moves in the banks today? This is wild. Goldman Sachs up 13% right now. I could go down a long list of them. Is Basel III dead, if it wasn't already?
Yeah, I think Basel III is dead, or like in The Princess Bride, it's mostly dead.
Yeah.
But look, the
Great
financials are, isn't it a great movie? The financials are essentially a high beta on the economy. So if you believe, and again, I'm trying to be objective here, if you're looking at the equity market's up on the expectation of stronger growth, and the financials are a high beta to GDP. So if we sustain 3% GDP or higher, and inflation does moderate, as I think it will, then the banks are doing what they're supposed to do.
Well, so as we consider potential policy here and regulation, we've talked with you before, Joe, about some of the other policy ideas that have been put forward, like on immigration, for example, the ideas that around mass deportation and the economic impact it ultimately could have if millions of people who are contributing to the labor force right now, who are paying into things like Social Security, were to leave the country. How should we be gaming that out, and the realism of trying to get that many people out of the country in an expeditious manner?
Joe Lavorgna, private citizen, doesn't expect mass deportation.
Okay.
My strong sense and gut instinct is that we're going to enforce the laws. We're going to make sure, the administration will make sure that there is more legal immigration that comes through. However, there are a lot of potential bad actors, as we know, not to get into details, that need to be removed, and I think law enforcement will do so. But I do not, personally, this is me, Joe Lavorgna speaking, do not expect mass deportation. The other factor I want to mention is that if you look at labor force participation, we're about 3/4 of a point below where we were pre-COVID. That's over 1 million workers. So if the economy can grow and we can get labor force participation to rise further, that would offset any modest effect that we may not be getting through immigration, and will clearly be benefiting the U.S. workers that are here.
This would be a very different FTC than we have right now. When I mentioned Goldman earlier, I'm thinking IPOs, I'm thinking mergers and acquisitions. Is that what we mean when we say animal spirits?
Yeah, animal spirits, confidence in the outlook, yeah.
What's the M&A situation going to look like in Trump 2.0?
Well, certainly there will be much more M&A activity. I don't think... To me, it's going to be more entrepreneurial. I mean, I always would tell people, and I highlighted this when I was in the administration, if you looked at small business sentiment, it was the highest under President Trump than any administration. So there is, I think, a dynamism and an animal spirit that is reflective in an entrepreneurialism a type of role, and that is going to be, I think, beneficial to activity that allows people to transact. And by the way, unlike tariffs and things like that, this sounds pretty basic. I don't think this is insightful, but President Trump's a businessman, and I think you have to look at the transactional nature of how he approaches things. And there was a great quote from a reporter of the Pittsburgh Gazette, I believe, 8 years ago, said, don't take President Trump literally, but take him seriously. And I find too often we get caught up in the rhetoric and get caught up in things that divide us. I don't really believe that to be the case in the second term, or at least I hope.
As we consider entrepreneurialism, being able to jumpstart things, we have to look at the cost of capital. And that brings me to something that's coming up tomorrow, as if we all haven't had enough this week. A Federal Reserve decision. They're expected to cut 25 basis points. The market is now pricing in fewer cuts over the course of the next year, Joe, in part maybe due to the outcome of this election. What do you think about the path?
No question. The market is expecting faster growth. I think it's perhaps incorrectly expecting inflation is going to be higher, but is expecting faster growth and then less inflation. And because the president's going to try to make permanent, I think he will, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. There's no big tax hike coming in 26, and therefore there's no fiscal cliff, which means there's less pressure on the Fed to cut. So I think initially the Fed will probably cut less. They'll cut 25 tomorrow. To me, December is probably a pause, and then we'll reevaluate and we'll see, where personnel is in the Trump administration and what policies are advocated, because right now this is still guesswork.
Pretty interesting to consider what will happen over the course of the next month. Your phone's going to be ringing. What job would you want in a Trump administration? Again.
I said this the other day. I said, look, I'm very happy where I am. It'd be an honor to serve. Yeah. And We'll just play it by ear. We'll see. I love the markets. I love coming on. I like having a nice conversation with you guys. And certainly if the president called, it would be hard to say no. But right now I'm happy, and we'll see what happens. I feel like, I like to think I've got some options, but we'll see.
So we'll see you on the North Lawn at some point soon.
Hopefully not cut. Well, I won't say it. Thank you.
Either way, we always welcome you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We appreciate you joining us on this day after the election. Joe Lavorgna, of course, formerly of the Trump White House, now at SMBC Nikko Securities on this day after the election, a day in which markets are ripping, the S&P 500 at a fresh record high, and the bond market seeing big moves with the 10-year yield up 17 basis points. We'll have more ahead on the markets and the politics with our political panel next on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
They are still counting votes. We still have some important Senate races to be called here, Kailey, but the transition on the presidential level has already begun. Donald Trump is now officially the president-elect.
Yep, having won 277 electoral college votes at this point, but it is expected he could win many more than that. For all of our months of discussion about how this race was incredibly tight, going to be decided by very close margins, the margins Donald Trump was able to put up over the last 24 hours have been pretty remarkable, adding to what he experienced in 2016 and 2020. And it's not just the Electoral College we're watching here, but the popular vote, which he is currently winning by roughly 5 million votes. He did not get the popular vote in the first 2 cycles he ran in.
Defying most predictions that we described here on the air, talking to various pollsters who do this for a living, confounding us to the point where it's now being called a red wave, or as Romaine Bostick called it from Detroit, a red wake-up call. Things went late into the night. You probably didn't get much sleep yourself. The whole nation is bleary-eyed this morning. J.D. Vance got up to the podium while Donald Trump was delivering his victory speech last night in West Palm Beach. Let's listen.
Well, Mr. President, I appreciate you allowing me to join you on this incredible journey. I thank you for the trust that you placed in me. And I think that we just witnessed the greatest political comeback in the history of the United States of America.
Joining us now for more, our political panel, Democratic strategist and partner at ROKK Solutions, Kristen Hawn, alongside Republican strategist and West Front Strategies principal, Ashley Davis. Thank you both for being with us on this day after. Ashley, just to begin with you, J.D. Vance calls it the greatest political comeback in the history of the United States, and he is not alone in characterizing this in that way. After a loss in 2020, after January 6, 2021, Donald Trump is going to be the 47th president of the United States. What does it say to you?
He's also going to be a very decisive president of the United States. I mean, the win, which I think is probably good or bad, is good for the country in regards to there's no question about who won. And that's really not a political statement. I would say the same thing if Kamala would have won. The fact that it's not hanging on chads or anything else is a good sign. But yeah, it is a huge political comeback. I mean, who would have thought, how many times was he indicted? How many times has...
He's been convicted on 34 felony counts.
Yeah, and indicted more. Yeah. And so, I mean, just the fact that he was able to do this and come back, I actually think it shows, one, how he does talk and resonate with parts of this country that a lot of us don't talk to every day, and also just how upset the country was. And I think that's what shows. And I think that we, a collective, we probably need to take a look at the people that have spoken about how unhappy they are and want the change in our country.
Yeah. Kristen Hawn, a lot of Democrats are feeling bruised this day after. It's not just the presidency, it's Congress. You spent quite a good amount of time on Capitol Hill as a blue dog Democrat. How do you see this today?
I think you've already seen kind of the blame game starting, the finger pointing. I think, as Democrats, we need to take a look, like what Ashley said. Why were the people not happy? What are we talking to them about? How are we talking to them? And really think about that. This automatic, some of the talking points I've seen out there from some Democrats saying, we just didn't lean into the progressive, the liberal side enough, I think is the wrong lesson to take from this. There were no more votes to be got from there. We need to think about how we are listening and talking to the American people all across the country. I think there was a lot of fear mongering. I think that there was a lot of misinformation out there, and I think it'll take us months, if not years, to figure out what we need to do, particularly heading into the midterms.
Well, and I wonder how you're reacting to the demographic breakdown we've seen in exit polls. Kristen, it's looking like Kamala Harris, who would have been the first female president in the United States if she had won, is going to win fewer female votes than Joe Biden did in 2020 for all of the talk about momentum among women. What does that say to you?
Well, I mean, I think there's also she had, one of the shortest runs for the presidency, and I think that probably hampered her ability to really define herself beyond, Joe Biden. I think also, we were fresh off of 4 years with President Trump, and people were sick of it, and they voted that way. So I think it's not necessarily her. I think it was, you look at what's happening at the time and when it's happening. And I unfortunately think that we're going to get 2 years with the midterms and 4 years down the road, and people are going to be reminded of how exhausted they are with having to wake up and listen to President Trump every day.
Ashley, your thoughts on the gender battle? This had really devolved into a men versus women election. We were told, and a lot of Democrats are asking today, a lot of women are asking, why is America not capable of getting its arms around this idea of electing a female president?
I wish I knew, because I obviously believe in that a lot. I actually think, though, that what people thought was going to get her across the finish line, though, was the abortion issue or the Dodd's ruling. And I think what happened, and obviously there's going to be days to come which we can look at this data, but it looks like many women, even in the suburban areas, cared more about security, the border, the economy, than they even did kind of these rights. And also, I do believe the American people, as a pro-choice Republican, understand that now this is in the states, right? I mean, I don't think that people are, the rhetoric that went around about the Dobbs decision, how no one's ever going to be able to have, female rights, is just not correct. And so I think people aren't believing that message. But listen, I think the biggest demographic that came out of yesterday is 1 in 3 of color voters voted for Trump. I mean, that was high in 2004 when Bush won re-elect, but it hasn't been that high since. And I think that that's pretty.
It's remarkable for a
Republican. It's remarkable.
We should remind our audience as well, you did support a woman for president. You were a Nikki Haley supporter at the beginning of this campaign. Is there a place for you in this party?
Listen, I'm just like her. I mean, I'm a conservative. I believe in conservatism in regards to financial conservatism. I'm very socially liberal, but I do believe in Republican policies. And so at the end of the day, am I happy that there's a Republican Senate? Absolutely. Do I not believe in some of Kamala Harris's policies? Absolutely. But I do believe in a woman becoming president. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But at the end of the day, I'm a Republican. I'm going to support Republicans.
Well, as Ashley raises the Senate, Kristen, we already know that the Senate is gone for the Democrats. It has been flipped. The question now is the margin. And the bigger question is the House. What races will you be watching that have yet to be called?
I'm watching a lot of races where people are doing well. Jim Costa in California always does well. Henry Cuellar won in Texas, which is great. You look at people who are really strong, like Mary Peltola out in Alaska, who, Lisa Murkowski said she wanted her to be back in the House. So races like those, I think, there are a number of them that were flipped last night. It'll be several days, if not weeks, before we know who has control of the House. But I think at the end of the day, as a House person, those members and those candidates who really know their districts and really speak to the voters on a local level will be the ones who ultimately pull out the win here. And for Democrats, obviously, control of the House is really important so that we don't have Donald Trump as president completely unchecked in his power.
You know what the loudest question I'm hearing from Democrats today is, Kristen, Hawn, what would have happened if she picked Josh Shapiro?
I'm not sure it would have made that much of a difference, honestly. I think we had a really strong team and a strong vice presidential candidate in Tim Walz. So, I think that any conversations within my party about what if is not productive at this point. We need to all be sitting down at the table and being like, what happened here? And what do we need to do differently?
Well, and then there's the question of what happens next. Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, we know, Ashley, but who is likely to be in this cabinet as this transition gets underway?
I think you'll see a lot of governors and you'll see a lot of senators, especially if the Senate does end up being 54 Republicans, say. Obviously, McCormick's very close to winning in Pennsylvania and maybe Nevada or maybe not. We'll see. But I think that those are going to be easy to confirm. And I also think that it gives you a little bit of room to have a vacancy in regards to other votes if the senators are going up for some sort of confirmation. I don't think if the numbers stay this close one way or the other, and going back to Kristen's comment, I think we're down to like 9 races in the House, from what I understand, about, what's going to happen, and I think no matter what happens, it's going to be very close. But you can't take very many House members out of, no matter, if you're a Republican, unless we're in the minority. I think you see Elise Stefanik go somewhere.
Interesting.
She wants what, UN ambassador?
That sounds right. Nice to have you in New York today. We're lucky. Thank you. Ashley Davis with us, of course, and Kristen Hawn, our panel today on Balance of Power, the day after the race. Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.